Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Franklin. I'm happy to welcome you back to the Center for Security Policy for our webinar series. Remember, we do this every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. To check out our schedule, go to securefreedom.org and click on the webinar tab. I'll also give you a preview of upcoming events at the end of today's broadcast. Today's webinar is entitled, Where is the Biden Administration's Iran Policy Going? Featuring David Wurmser and Victoria Coates and moderated by the Center's President and CEO, Fred Fleitz. Before we get started, please note that you are in listen-only mode, but you can submit text questions in the Q&A box in your GoToWebinar panel, and I will read as many questions as I can at the end of the program. This event is being recorded and will be available at our YouTube channel at youtube.com/securefreedom and on our website at securefreedom.org. With that, I'll hand it over to the Center's President and CEO, Fred Fleitz.
Matt, thank you, and I'd like to thank all of our viewers for joining us today for this important webinar. During the campaign, Joe Biden and his staff made it clear that if Biden won the election, he would quickly rejoin the deeply flawed 2015 nuclear deal and then move to negotiating a better deal that would be longer lasting and would fix the flaws of the current agreement. Well, here we are, March 31st, and it hasn't happened that way. Biden officials were stunned earlier this month when Iran snubbed them and refused to attend a meeting in Europe that European states were hosting, which would have given U.S. and Iranian officials the first opportunity to meet to discuss how to get both states back into full compliance with the nuclear deal. Since then, Iranian officials have said they are refusing to meet with the U.S. unless the U.S. drops all sanctions. And Iranian officials are claiming that they will never agree to U.S. efforts to alter the agreement or to come up with a better agreement. Now, the U.S. has offered a number of concessions to try to get Iran to the negotiating table. The Iranians have been fairly stubborn in not budging. Some of these concessions appear to be downgrading U.S. relations with Israel and Saudi Arabia. And I'm happy to say that one of our guests today is very knowledgeable of this problem because she helped work on the Abraham Accords, President Trump's successful diplomatic initiative to promote peace in the Middle East by encouraging Middle East states to normalize relations with Israel. It was a real breakthrough that I think is being put in danger by Biden administration policies. Meanwhile, there's an effort a bipartisan effort in Congress and the House and Senate to pressure the Biden administration not to rejoin the nuclear deal unless there are significant changes to fix it. And there have to be efforts to address Iran's malign behavior. And this has included over the past couple of years missile attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and on a Saudi oil refinery. So we got a lot of problems here to address. I just want to talk briefly about the nuclear deal. I think most of you are familiar with it. In 2015, the Obama administration made enormous concessions to get this nuclear deal. It was supposed to be a legacy for President Obama. But the problem is it allows Iran to continue to enrich uranium with thousands of centrifuges, develop advanced centrifuges, and Iran would actually receive a heavy water reactor that would allow it to produce a quarter of a weapon's worth of plutonium every year. In effect, Iran could be in full compliance with this agreement and continue its nuclear weapons research. And after 15 years, when most of the provisions of the agreement expire, Iran would come out of it with an industrial scale nuclear weapons program. There also was weak verification and missiles. Iran's nuclear weapons delivery system were excluded at the insistence of Iranian officials. It was, in fact, a terrible deal. But if you hear Secretary of State Blinken and other defenders of the agreement comment, they claim that it was a good agreement and that Iran was complying with it. And they say this because they note that the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has repeatedly said that Iran is complying. Well, let's talk about that. The IAEA found that Iran was in compliance with activities at declared nuclear sites. Now, there's reasons to believe that this was not true, that evidence to the contrary is being swept under the rug. The problem is there was substantial covert nuclear weapons activity at non-nuclear weapon sites. And we know this beyond a shadow of a doubt because of documents that Israel stole from Iran in 2018, now known as the Nuclear Archive documents, hundreds of thousands of documents, proving that there are covert nuclear weapon sites and in 2018, currently were engaged in weapons-related activities. There also were many, many instances of Iran not declaring previous nuclear activities. And if it had declared these, the nuclear agreement wouldn't have been set in place in the first place. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu, as we all know, is a bit of a theatrical guy. He gave a presentation in May of 2018 about these documents, and his conclusion was Iran lied. And when you see this, it's clear that not only did Iran lie at the beginning of the agreement, it continued to conceal crucial nuclear activities while it was underway. Over the last couple of years, Iran has allowed inspections of some of these sites to IAEA inspectors. Well, what did they find? They found extensive efforts by the Iranians to clean these sites up and sanitize them, but despite those efforts, the IAEA still found traces of enriched uranium. And even last week, the IAEA Director General said these traces of uranium need to be resolved before we move forward in the JCPOA. So this is the agreement that the Biden administration is racing to rejoin, is claiming the agreement worked, is claiming Iran is in compliance, and these are things we know are just not true. There's so much to discuss today, and I'm happy to say I have with me today two of our country's leading experts on Iran who also are parts of the Center for Security Policy's team. Dr. Victoria Coates recently joined the center as a senior fellow. Her previous positions include president of the Middle East Broadcasting Networks, senior policy advisor to the Secretary of Energy, deputy national security advisor for Middle Eastern and North African affairs, and senior advisor for national security to Senator Ted Cruz. Victoria, welcome.
Thank you, Fred.
Also joining us is Dr. David Wurmser. David is director of the Center's Project on Global Anti-Semitism and the U.S.-Israel relationship. He also is a senior analyst with the Center. David is a former U.S. Navy Reserve Intelligence Officer with extensive national security experience working for the State Department, the Pentagon, Vice President Cheney, and the National Security Council. David, welcome.
Thanks. It's great to be here, Fred.
I'm proud to say that Victoria and David have written extensively on these issues. You can find copies of their analysis on our website, securefreedom.org, including links to their many media interviews. I'd like to start with both of you to simply give me an update on where you think Biden's Iran policy is and how is Iran reacting to it. Victoria, let's start with you.
Well, thank you, Fred. And as you said, there's so much to discuss today, and I'm very glad to be with you and Dave and all the folks joining virtually. I believe we've arrived today at day 70 of the Biden administration, so we now have to go on. There were a lot of statements during the transition about how they would be very cautious. They were not going to lift sanctions. Secretary Blinken wanted Iran hawks on his staff to provide alternative views. Unfortunately, none of that has come to pass. What has happened is, as you reviewed, we've had a series of what I'm calling preemptive concessions to the Iranians. They'd be steps like taking the Yemeni Houthi off the foreign terrorist organization list, relaxing the restrictions that Secretary Pompeo had put on Iranian diplomats coming over to the United Nations, freezing the arms sales to UAE and Saudi. All of these things were sweeteners to the Iranians, but what the Iranians kept insisting on was sanctions relief before they would get into any negotiations, and we are now seeing that unfolding. Again, preemptive sanctions relief. Things like unfreezing the funds in South Korea, turning a blind eye to the oil sales to China. These are all ways you can give economic relief to the mullahs without formally doing so in a way that would raise the objections of the Congress. So I think from the perspective of Iran, as you mentioned, this is the best of all possible worlds. They are getting the economic lifeline when they desperately need it. They are in no hurry to accelerate this process toward negotiations because they're already getting what they want, and they're giving absolutely nothing. They're continuing to take pot shots at Saudi Arabia, attack our interests in Iraq, and they can just play the waiting game now. In terms of the JCPOA itself, I think you also touched on an extremely important point, which is that it was fraudulently negotiated from the get-go. The Iranians pledged to then Secretary Kerry and his cohorts that they never had a nuclear weapons program, that it was always peaceful. When the deal was completed, Kerry came out and told us how they were going to use their civil nuclear program to cure cancer, which, as you've noticed, hasn't happened yet. But what we did discover with the revelation of the archive is that was a lie. It was false. So the whole thing is fraudulent and rotten at its core. And so the idea that we would somehow race to get back into a fundamentally flawed deal while we are squandering the extraordinary leverage built up during the previous administration is really mind-boggling. Get into this more later, but I think we're going to have to rely on, at least for the next 2 years, as much as we can, on our minorities, they're large four minorities in the Congress, to try to block this thing as much as possible, because otherwise they seem pretty much hell-bent on getting back into the JCPOA.
David, what's your take?
Well, first of all, I agree with literally everything that Victoria said. I think the diplomatic effort to control Iran's nuclear program, what happened in the Obama era JCPOA was sort of on steroids, a series of several themes that had appeared since really 2000, and attempting the diplomatic course here, which is that there were revelations after revelations after revelations. You can go back to 2001, 2, 3, very disturbing revelations that quite clearly suggested Iran had an active nuclear weapons program with nuclear warhead development underway, and so forth. And these things would come out in the IAEA reports, and then after a year or 2 or 3, because of the diplomatic efforts, they'd sort of just fade away into the background, and they were never resolved. So when you got to the JCPOA itself, there's no agreement that can work if you don't get a good baseline. There's no verification structure that can proceed without some sort of an effective baseline. And the Iranians, under the agreement even, were committed to such a baseline. And Fred, as you said, and Victoria, as you said, they never were in good faith on that concession to provide an accurate baseline. They simply lied. They did what the Libyans did at one point when we discovered their nuclear program, which is, we'll give it up, but we don't have one. We came back to them and pretty clearly told the Libyans, yeah, you did. And so part of the Libyan agreement was to ensure that there was a proper scrubbing of absolutely everything in the country so that we have a good baseline of where they are once this agreement gets underway. Iran never lived up to that. So this agreement was flawed from day one. The second thing is the agreement never accounted for the geopolitical and internal Iranian impact of the agreement. You have a regime that has almost periodically faced some very grave internal crises. And when it does, it tends to reach out a little bit to the international community and show a little bit more flexibility, not genuine, but feigned flexibility, in part for its own domestic audience, to show, look, the world is afraid of us. The world understands we are here to stay and we are going to be a nuclear power. So they use it to show the weakness of the world as opposed to the regime, and then they translate that into an internal message to their own people. Don't mess with us. You know, the world's afraid of us. Don't mess with us. And that's been effective again and again in the West, and every diplomatic effort that it's undertaken with Iran simply ignores that dynamic. And ultimately, the only real solution to this problem is not to have a regime that is as murderous and as destabilizing regionally as the Iranian regime is. So these diplomatic efforts try to address a tactical problem while surrendering the larger strategic objective.
I want to narrow in on what concessions might be next by the Biden administration. Over the last few days, it was reported that Biden officials offered to Iran that it would partially lift U.S. sanctions if Iran would stop enriching uranium to the 20% uranium-235 level. And I think there was another provision that it asked for. Iran rejected this outright. Victoria, starting with you, I assume that we're on a slippery slope, and I'm wondering what you think of this offer and what's coming next.
Yeah, I think it's very concerning. And the other thing that's caught my attention along these lines is the administration is going to have some constraints on their ability to lift all sanctions, because not all sanctions are related to the nuclear issue. We have human rights sanctions, among others. And you may have seen the State Department's human rights report came out yesterday, in which they very dramatically downplayed Iranian human rights abuses. The sort of easy data point to point to is that Amnesty International last year estimated that the number of activists who were murdered in the 2019 protests ranged somewhere from 304, which was the literally verifiable number, to 1,500, which was a much more realistic estimate given all the people that were disappeared. And so in last year's human rights report, we had used the 1,500 figure. They used the 304 figure, which is mightily different. And Secretary Blinken did not mention Iran in his remarks about the human rights report. So my concern is that not only are they going to lift the nuclear-related sanctions, but that they're also going to find ways to lift human rights sanctions by somehow portraying a kinder, gentler group of mullahs in Tehran. So we are definitely on the slippery slope. As I said, it's already started with this kind of passive relaxation of sanctions by not enforcing them. And I think there's no reason to think they won't be as aggressive as possible about lifting them.
So, David, what's your take on the Biden administration negotiating strategy, and do you believe they're going to accelerate their concessions in the run-up to Iran's elections this June?
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you raised the Iranian elections in June, which the administration apparently anticipates will deliver a much more hardline Iranian government, whatever hardline means in this context, because when you really get down to their regional behavior, their aspirations, and their fanaticism, there's not much of a difference between hardliners and moderates. But this is a construct that consistently is evoked to lend urgency and concessions to the diplomatic process. So I think the administration, already not really understanding how to read Iran, is heading into a situation where they've convinced themselves that whatever they're going to get a better deal now than in 5 months, 6 months, 7 months, so that they have to move with urgency, and so they've put a stopwatch to themselves, and that's no way to negotiate. The second thing I think that's rather, sorry, Fred, I didn't want to, you were going to ask another question. So,
Well, I want to move on in terms of lifting sanctions to talk a little bit about President Trump's maximum pressure. And, those of us who are supporters of the president's strategy believe that this is successful. But I'm wondering, do you think that the Biden administration will lift all sanctions on Iran? And what will Iran do with that windfall of cash, Victoria?
Well, Fred, it's kind of like a Back to the Future moment. As Dave said, the term moderate is a very false one for Iran, and we have tried this before. So we had Rouhani coming into office. He and his foreign minister, Zarif, are theoretically moderates. That's the way they're presented to the West. And what happened? We negotiated the JCPOA with them, massive concessions, lifting of economic pressure, and they went on a violent rampage from Yemen to Iraq to Lebanon to Syria. That's where they spent all the money. and none of it was spent on the Iranian people as we were promised. And so there is no reason to think that even if they race back into some deal with Rouhani over the next couple of weeks, that this movie will end any different way. They will take the money and they will reinvigorate their support for Hezbollah. We will have maybe another 100,000 missiles pointed at Israel from the north. They will reinvigorate their support for Hamas, creating even more of a dire situation there. And, I would assume Yemen is lost at that point, and we would have to be very concerned about Iraq. So, the notion that somehow there's going to emerge a reasonable centrist candidate for president is mythical, for starters. But the notion that these folks were moderate is also mythical.
No, I strongly agree with that. Supreme Leader Khamenei calls the shots in Iran, and why the Democrats don't understand that is just beyond me. Dave, I'm wondering your views on what would happen if all of the maximum pressure sanctions were lifted, and how would regional states respond to Iran getting such a huge influx of cash?
Well, yeah, just to finish up on the previous question too, all three of us have served in government, and all three of us have dealt directly with the Iranian issue when we served in government. And I'm sure all three of us have the same experience, which is it's not only what American policy is to do, what America seeks to do, it's what America doesn't do. When you look at Europe, they have an attempt underway to create an alternative banking structure to circumvent sanctions. However, under the previous administration, we warned them, you're not going to trade with us. Those banks will have problems with us if they trade with Iran. And no bank in their right mind in Europe, or very few banks in their right mind in Europe, would make the choice between Iran and the United States in the direction of Iran. So what we were actively, constantly doing, undermine those sanctions, undermine those attempts to circumvent sanctions. Doing nothing essentially lifts the sanctions, even if you theoretically keep them in place. So I just wanted to add that to what Victoria had said. Your question again, Fred, was, I'm sorry.
Well, I'm wondering, how do you think regional states will respond to Iran getting a huge influx of cash because we ended the maximum pressure campaign?
Well, befuddled and terrified. That will be their reaction. Because strategically, we talk about having an Iran agreement plus, which I suppose would mean to extend the terms of the agreement, and B, to include some areas of misbehavior by Iran that Israel and others in Saudi Arabia, UAE constantly raise. The problem here is that our actions speak louder than words. If we release some of this money, if we release the sanctions, if we encourage South Korea, as we did, to release some of the money, they know in the region where that money will go. It will go to Hezbollah, it will go to the Houthis, it will go to prosecuting the war that Iran is waging on all our allies in the region, a war that Iran is struggling to pay for. And lifting these sanctions just is a shot in the arm for Iran's strategic efforts. So we can talk about coming to an agreement with Iran about limiting their strategic misbehavior, but we've enabled them. And so it's completely contradictory. Also, the Iranians will never agree to such a deal plus. They will probably return to a deal minus, if at all.
I want to ask you another question, Dave, and then I have a special question for Victoria. It's related to what we just brought up. What's the significance of this new agreement trade agreement between Iran and China?
Well, there's a number of things that are very interesting about it. One is directly, Iran has essentially sold itself to China to become a minion of China. China's creating essentially an East Bloc type structure. This follows on the heels of doing similar things with Turkey. So what you see is the region dividing up on one level between the China bloc and the non-China bloc. So this sort of parallels the other fissures in the region, this inter-Sunni fissure between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, UAE, and between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Israel. So you see China's walking right into that and organizing a bloc against us and our allies, except that China is also trying to end around it and reach into Saudi Arabia. So that's one thing. The second thing about China that's very dangerous here is if we read the terms of the agreement, one of the very dangerous aspects of it was that they make a big point about supporting the JCPOA and a nuclear weapons-free zone. And you asked earlier about what might be the negotiating strategy of the Biden administration. I'm afraid that with the season of the non-proliferation treaties conferences coming up, you could see this as a major concession by the United States to Iran, to China, and to others to accept what a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. Now that sounds great, but what it means is that Israel has to disarm. And that is a very dangerous thing for our interests. Certainly the Israelis will never agree to it, which means diplomatically, all of a sudden, the whole effort to control Iran's nuclear weapons reduces to an effort to convince the Israelis to give up their nuclear structure. So I think the Chinese, it's in the agreement between Iran and China. I think this is one of those areas where I see great danger coming very fast.
That's a really good point. And you often hear from the left that it's unfair that Israel has nuclear weapons and Iran does not, and that we should pressure Israel to give them up first. It's perfectly fair because Iran is a state sponsor of terror that has threatened to blow Israel off the map. Israel's never said things like that about Iran. Israel is surrounded by enemies, and this nuclear weapons free zone has been used for decades to isolate Israel and to make the whole issue of disarmament in the Middle East about Israel. So I think you're exactly right. I hope the Biden administration does not go down that road. Victoria, you were part of so many teams in the NSC to negotiate many of the Trump administration's diplomatic successes, including the Abraham Accords. So I think you're the best person to ask about the Biden foreign policy team, particularly Rob Maley and the people who were working on the Iran issue. What can you tell our audience about these folks?
Well, it is again, it's another Back to the Future moment. I mean, these are all the same folks from the Obama-Biden team in the early 2010s, and these are people for whom the JCPOA is an article of faith. And it almost doesn't matter what's in the deal as long as we belong to something called the JCPOA. It validates their legacy. So I think, if you look at the hallmarks of Obama era policy towards the Middle East, we're simply going to see those replayed. It is the hostility to Israel that Dave just mentioned. One other interesting thing about the Human Rights Report is that while the language on Iran was softened, Israel's back in the Human Rights Report and very harshly dealt with from this team. So that is all back on the table. And then you look at their actions, as they're freeing up economic resources for Iran, they are freezing arms sales to our Gulf partners and allies. And so, you've had this bizarre disconnect with Saudi Arabia over the last 6 weeks, in which on the one hand, they're taking the Houthi off the FTO list, as I mentioned, and they've had to put out something like 6 separate statements from the State Department condemning Houthi terrorist activities, after they took them off the list. And so it's completely disconnected from reality, just as the previous episode was. And I think we'll have largely the same results if we keep the same team in place.
Now, you were involved in the Abraham Accords, and I'm wondering, I said earlier that they could be wrecked by the Biden administration, but I'm wondering if that's the case, or do you think they have a life of their own and efforts to get these agreements will proceed despite the Biden administration?
Well, I think they do have a life of their own. The fact of the matter is that absent strong U.S. guidance and leadership, it wouldn't happen. There is a correct perception that there was increasing cooperation between the Gulf and Israel in the period leading up to the Accords. But the fact of the matter is most levels of those governments weren't talking to each other. So the sort of connectivity that you would hope for doesn't exist. It is developing, and particularly between UAE and Israel, we have a very public sort of process in terms of economic coordination, which should extend to Bahrain and particularly Morocco and be very, very positive. That's a place where U.S. private industry, for example, can play an extremely important role, forward-leaning role, helpful role over these next couple of years. But very concerning to see the State Department's and the National Security Council's kind of interim guidance on national security strategy say that while they, in the abstract, support a normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel, that deal would have to follow certain parameters in terms of human rights in Saudi Arabia for the United States to support. So it's clearly, you have to behave in a certain way, or else, we're not going to support this. We won't provide that leadership or connectivity, which is just a massive missed opportunity for the United States. As you pointed out, and Dave pointed out, you've got China building their block in the Middle East. This should be our block. And unfortunately, we appear to be pushing it away.
David, you're director of one of the Center's marquee programs, our Project on Global Anti-Semitism and the U.S.-Israel relationship. And just for background of our audience, David did an incredible analysis on the recent Israeli elections. It's on our website, securefreedom.org. Please check it out. But given your background, David, I want to ask your commentary on where is Israel on these recent developments. We know that Benjamin Netanyahu attempted to meet with the Saudi Crown Prince recently. And we know that Netanyahu is a huge critic of the nuclear deal. So I'm wondering, how are they interpreting recent developments concerning Biden-Iran policy?
Well, like the Saudis are befuddled and terrified. The Israeli political spectrum actually has surprising consensus on the nuclear deal. They all dislike it. They all think it's insufficient. I'd say the differences of opinion are between those who think it's insufficient and those who think it's unworkable to begin with. So there's nobody who really likes it or thinks it's a safe deal. What you're seeing in Israel in the last few weeks is a combination that I would take very seriously. It's silence punctuated by increasingly aggressive statements. You had the chief of staff say that they were reviewing options for striking Iran. You had the head of they have a command that in essence is the Iran command. It's some name like Outer Circle Threats or something, Command for Outer Circle, but it's essentially their Iran command, who just 2 days ago gave a long interview saying that the plans they have are not to hamper the program, but to destroy it. So again, increasingly aggressive statements, yet at the same time, not only entirely because Israel went through one of its annual election cycles, but because probably as a matter of choice, there's been a strange degree of silence from Israel's leadership that you would expect to be a crescendo at this point on Iran. And I think this speaks, usually when the Israelis are that silent, it means they're very scared and they're contemplating things. So I think the Israelis see no real way to bring the nuclear program under control at this point. They see it galloping at this point forward. They have absolutely no faith that this administration, despite publicly saying they wish they would, they have no faith that this administration either knows what it's doing or has the gumption to really lay down a hard line. So they turn to the UAE, they turn to the Saudis. There might be a lot more going on under the table than we know about, but I don't believe the Israelis at all are sitting very comfortably or very quiet.
Victoria, the Biden administration is taking a different approach towards the Palestinians. And I think this also is going to have an effect on the Abraham Accords and efforts to get additional accords, or at least any accord that the U.S. is a party to. Where is the Biden administration going in terms of working with the Palestinians and a peace agreement between them and the Israelis?
Well, thanks for raising that, Fred, because it really is a very curious construct right now. Conventional wisdom for generations was that a deal for the Palestinians had to come before normalization deals with the Arabs. And, certainly as the Trump administration, we accepted that conventional wisdom, the president's original direction to Jared and Ambassador Friedman and Jason Greenblatt was to pursue, the deal of the century with the Palestinians, and to get to, sort of phase two, which would be normalization. The Palestinians flat out refused. I worked hard on that plan with that team. It was a good plan. You and I were both there when it was unveiled in January of last year. It was a good offer. And certainly the president expected the Palestinians to negotiate on their own behalf, but they just refused. They wouldn't come to the table. And then what turned out to be the deal of the century was the Abraham Accords, because the Arabs, the UAE and Bahrain, decided that the Palestinians didn't get a veto anymore on how they conducted their foreign policy. And what's remarkable to me is some of the Palestinians I've talked to, some of whom will be running in the elections that are theoretically taking place in a couple of months, they didn't like the Abraham Accords, but they see now the possibilities that they have opened, and they don't want to go back. The Palestinians don't want to go back. The Palestinian Authority thinks this is great because it's more money for them to keep them entrenched in power. But the Palestinian people want to move forward. They don't want to see the UAE and Bahrain getting all of this economic interplay with Israel, and they get nothing. And there are strong impulses on both the part of Bahrain and UAE to offer sort of joint programs that would be Israeli and Palestinian and UAE or Bahrain or both. So it's as if the administration is insisting on giving back to the Palestinian Authority a veto that the Arabs no longer support. And that's simply it's not going to work. And they're not going to be able to throw enough money at that situation for it to make any kind of measurable difference. And, certainly no one currently in power in Ramallah is going to be a reliable negotiating partner. And what's really tragic about it is there are Palestinians who can be good partners and who do want to move forward constructively and try to put what they consider to be the lies and the corruption of the past behind them, but they're not who the administration is embracing.
David, I know you want to comment on this, and I'm wondering if you could do so and also fold in some of your work on where the left and the Democratic Party seems to be going concerning Israel.
Sure. Okay, on the issue of this, the Abraham Accords, the peace process, the Palestinians, I think one of the underlying themes, diplomacy is either, when it works, diplomacy either codifies a reality or is aligned with reality and flows with it. There's a reality underneath everything that the Abraham Accords tapped into, which is that an increasing circle of Arabs realized that their interests, they couldn't wait anymore. Their interests drove them to come to terms with Israel. There were more benefits and advantages to dealing with Israel than to continuing to ignore it. I think the recent Israeli elections produced an interesting phenomenon showing that Israeli Arabs are thinking the same, that the party, the Arab party that advocated working with an Israeli government, specifically working with a right-wing Israeli government under Netanyahu, was in the interests of the Arabs in Israel. But these are the voting Arabs inside what we call the Green Line. And it was a tremendous electoral success for this party. And it really shows that Arabs are sick and tired of these theoretical stage-like performances demanding Palestinian rights and are much more interested in bread and butter issues that the Israeli state can deliver them. We saw some videos going from the Arab Israelis to the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank. You saw a year ago or so some videos by Tzvi Yechezkieli, who's the Arab Affairs correspondent on believe it's Channel 12 in Israel. And they were translated, by the way, by Carolyn Glick, so it's accessible to us in an English-speaking audience. Palestinians in the West Bank, when left alone, basically said the same thing. Enough already with this whole Palestinian national issue. Just help us get our feet on the ground. And we have this tremendously powerful economy that we're semi-part of. Let us take part. So you see underneath it all this tremendous movement that's happening. And the second half of your question was what was it?
The American left and the Democratic Party, where are they going on Israel?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we see by the leadership that finds its role in the administration. We have seen for years, sort of culturally, the left turn against Israel. You see it in progressive movements on campuses and so forth. This worked its way into Congress, where you saw congressional leaders parading to say Al Sharpton, who has a strong history of anti-Semitic rhetoric that has led to Jews being killed. So it's incitement to kill that has worked for him. This no longer is taboo for too many congressional leaders. We saw the difficulty with which the Democratic Party had to address the anti-Semitism of Ilhan Omar and others. Now we see it creeping into the administration itself. We see the head of intelligence in the White House is Maher Bitar, who was for another period in his life in Jerusalem in the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency office there. UNRWA is a weird creation. The entire world has millions and millions and millions of refugees, but they all fall under a United Nations refugee organization. The Palestinians alone have their own refugee organization from 1948, UNRWA, which the Trump administration defunded because ultimately, in an actual numerical sense, there are only 20-some thousand
Okay, I need you,
left.
Dave. You're getting a little bit off target. I need you to wrap up this answer because I want to ask one more question before we invite our audience.
Sure.
Specifically on the left and the Democratic Party on Israel. Just maybe another minute.
Yeah, I think there's an increasing intolerance of Israel, an increasing tolerance of anti-Semitism, dangerous tolerance of anti-Semitism, that is hiding behind anti-Zionism, but not anymore. You see more and more direct anti-Jewish statements coming from leadership positions inside the White House, a number of people being appointed who have a strong record of anti-Semitic rhetoric, and in Congress, and the inability of the leadership to challenge them, leadership of the Democratic Party, to challenge them, let alone exorcise them from their reign.
So I'm going to ask you both for a short answer to this analysis of mine, and that is, I believe that Obama attempted an Iran-centric foreign policy at the expense of our friends and allies in the Middle East, with the mistaken belief that if we engaged Iran, we could promote stability and peace in the Middle East and get Iran to rejoin the international community. I think Biden believes that also. Victoria, what's your take?
No, I think you're absolutely right, Fred. I mean, what they did is turn, 70 years of bipartisan U.S. policy that supported Israel, embraced our Gulf partners and allies, and viewed after 1979 Iran as the clear enemy of the United States. I think they thought they could turn that paradigm on its head, reverse it, and that if you muzzled Israel and pushed the Gulfies away and embraced Iran, you would create a new structure that would solve all of the old problems. I think what the Trump administration demonstrated in its turn is the opposite is true. What we have to do is embrace more robustly Israel, be more supportive of our Gulf allies, and that's what will bring about positive regional change. Unfortunately, I agree with you. I think the Biden administration is going again in the opposite direction.
Dave, short answer.
Yeah, I think that the left has always looked at these problems as a function of some humiliation we have done against the region that has led to rage and despair, and that we need to address those issues, which include giving those nations like Iran a sense that we acknowledge their interests and allow them to rampage over other countries. So I think that's deep down in what we believe, whereas the historical record suggests the opposite, is that regional rage against us is generally a function of disdain, of dismissal, of the feeling that we in the West don't deserve to be as strong and as successful as we are because we're a pathetic culture. So the more we display goodwill and fealty to their interests, the more it confirms that rage and leads to greater rage. And I think if you look at the historical record, those who believe rage is a function of disdain in the region rather than humiliation and despair, the historical record bears that out.
Well, David and Victoria, thank you. I promised our loyal viewers an opportunity to submit questions, so I'm going to invite my colleague, Matt Franklin, to read some of the questions from the audience.
Recently, a bipartisan group of pro-Israel Democrats and Republicans have come together and signed a letter written to Secretary of State Blinken, urging him to prioritize bipartisan cooperation on any new agreement with Iran. Do you all believe that Blinken will respond favorably towards designing any new Iran deal, or is the Biden agenda too stubborn to consider any input from Republicans at all?
Well, I can jump on that real quick. I mean, I'm certainly aware of the letter, and I think it's a worthy initiative. It is encouraging that there are a number of Democrats in the Senate who are willing to at least consider a project like that. I think it could have been much stronger. And as I said in my opening remarks, we are really going to have to both rely on our representation in Congress and also support them as much as possible. You know, we all went through the kind of hardship of Corker-Cardin in 2015, which promised the premise of the legislation was it would give Congress some kind of role of oversight. That, of course, did not turn out to be the case. So we can't make that mistake again. But we can be very supportive. Obviously, my old boss, Senator Cruz, is a strong voice on this. Senator Hagerty is a very welcome new voice who's really taken up the charge very aggressively. You know, obviously, Senator Cotton, Senator Rubio, we have a very, very strong bench. And so hopefully we can support them, and the State Department will see that they have some value to add.
I would add to that it appears that the Biden administration is doing what the Obama administration did. They're going through the motions of pretending to consult with Congress and with Middle East allies before they just basically present a fait accompli. The nuclear deal is not a treaty. At least the U.S. does not treat it as one. It was not ratified by the Senate, wasn't even signed by anybody. However, the Iranian parliament did ratify it. It was negotiated in such a way that Obama could bypass the Senate. And you can be sure that's exactly what Biden is planning. He may be consulting with Congress, but he's not interested in their input.
I agree. I would add one thing. I do think that there's some congressmen who, either out of genuine belief or out of electoral reasons, need to express some support for Israel on this issue. But it does go back to your question, Fred, of earlier, that the center of gravity in the Democratic Party is increasingly in an anti-Israeli state. And it's not clear that the leadership has the internal strength within the Democratic Party to insist on discipline on the Israel issue in a positive way for Israel at this point.
All right, next, what is the status of Iranian opposition within Iran?
I can take first stab at it. Every day you hear of something else going wrong in Iran. Last week we had some riots in a city up more towards the Pakistani border. We've had over the last year constant unrest here and there. It's clear that ever since 2009, and probably a lot longer than that, 2003, the Iranian people have divorced from their leadership, but they're demoralized. Every time they move forward to do something, there seems to be some international deal that validates the Iranian regime, whether it's in 2009, the Obama administration outright during a period of grave threat to the regime said that it has more important things to worry about than Iranian human rights. It has, namely, to get a deal with the awful Iranian regime. That really took the steam out of those riots. We had over the last year, clearly the sanctions, year or two, the sanctions really were beginning to bite hard. You saw demonstration after demonstration say, why are we paying the price for Palestine, for Gaza, for Yemen? Iranians were acting like Iranians. They basically wanted to have a decent life, and they didn't want their money flowing to these military adventures all over the region. And this was a crescendo of violence and unrest in Iranian cities over the last 2 years. So I think the Iranian people are there, but then here you have an administration which seems to be determined to come up with another deal. The Iranian people read the writing on the wall that they can take to the streets, they'll be mowed down, and nobody will support them. So they retreat back into a sort of feigned passivity. And it's unfortunate because it just prolongs the period in which this regime survives.
If I could just add a couple of footnotes to Dave's excellent points there. Early on in the Biden administration, 30 Iranian activists took the unprecedented step of writing an open letter to President Biden and signing their names to it. These are people in Iran. The regime will tell you there is no opposition, that they're hopelessly fractured, that they don't have any leadership. Well, here these brave individuals were standing up and saying, here we are. And I think the response to the China deal, which has been very negative inside Iran, is an indicator that they're there. And one of the pieces I've worked on since I've been at the center has been with my NSC colleague, Rob Greenway, on a plan we had to pipe satellite internet into Iran, which can be done now. You might have seen Elon Musk, for example, has just launched the first satellites for Starlink, which is going to be SpaceX's satellite-provided internet. We can do this. We can get communications to these people to help them. And, you know, we're hoping to garner some bipartisan support in Congress for this. It's fungible technology. We can use it other places. But I think just wholehearted, full-throated support for the people of Iran who are willing to take these risks, who are willing to try to create a better future for their children, is something that should not be controversial.
In terms of U.S. concessions to Iran via Syria, do you see the Biden administration putting the brakes on the pressure campaign against the Assad regime, in particular ending continued enforcement of the Caesar Syrian Civilian Protection Act, despite reports that the State Department has promised Syrian political opposition leaders that the U.S. will continue sanctions enforcement against Assad and his allies?
You know, when you look at Anthony Blinken's statement on Syria and the Golan Heights, there was a very interesting phrase he used, which was that he understands Israel's presence on the Golan Heights given the current security circumstances. This was seen as an affirmation of support for Israel, but it could be read the opposite. Namely, he's basically beginning to lay the foundation for a grand bargain on Syria, which is that Iran is offered some presence and some permanent influence in Syria away from Israel's border, maybe in eastern Syria, in exchange for which the Israelis give up the Golan Heights. You have in the Israeli press already some hopeful far left voices saying this, that there might be some big deal out there that could happen, Iran for the Golan, essentially. Again, I cannot imagine looking at the personalities involved in this administration on Iran policy, Robert Malley, Maher Bitar, Hedi Anmar, and so forth. These are people who would jump at that opportunity and pressure Israel to go along. And additionally, it reverses one of the Trump successes and major actions. Is another way they can say we're the anti-Trump, is to reverse the recognition of the Golan Heights. So I think that's out there, and I think Iran wouldn't leave Syria, but they could be pushed toward the eastern side of it more, which strategically is as dangerous as leaving an overall entirety of Syria. the only hope to avoid such a scenario may be the Russians, because they're not very happy with the Iranian domination of Syria at this point. So they might sabotage it. But that's a really thin reed to base your hopes on at this point.
How does China's new oil deal with Iran affect the Biden administration's strategy towards Iran?
I think they probably think it's a good thing. They think it's a way to funnel support into Tehran. One unintended consequence, though, that I think Beijing might want to pay a little bit of attention to is they've basically purchased a massive unfunded liability in what they've tried to buy in Iran, because $400 billion over 25 years is not going to resolve the economic catastrophe that is the current state of Iran. You know, that it sounds good and it sounds splashy, but China has a way of promising these things and then not actually delivering the check in the end. And I think as they look under the hood and kick the tires, they're going to realize that yeah, they bought a bunch of cheap gas, but the vehicle is pretty shaky. So again, this garnered a lot of headlines. I think it's a good wake-up call for Chinese intentions in the region, but I'm not sure it's going to turn out to be as wonderful as they think it is.
Is Iran still refusing inspections of their military sites?
As far as I know, yes. I think, Fred, you're probably more of an expert on this, but first of all, they don't admit a lot of these sites are nuclear. So they keep saying, well, you know, you don't have a right to just inspect all our military installations, so you can't go here. So I don't believe they're at all allowing much access to them.
Iran still has said that their military sites are off limits, and the IAEA and the parties to the agreement have not challenged them on that. And if there's robust nuclear weapons activity going on, it's taking place at military bases.
Do you think Israel's military is capable of destroying or neutralizing Iran's nuclear program?
I do. I think all these debates you see in the West about oh, can Israel go there? Can they do this? Can they do that? This is something the Israelis have been thinking about for 20 years. And when they put their mind to it, I'm sure they have a solution. So I would, with high confidence, say the Israelis have an option. The only thing I'm worried about with the option is that it assumed American acquiescence. Maybe not American coordination, but American acquiescence. I'm a little worried about this administration doing things like withholding as the potential for an Israeli strike would increase. They could withhold things like IFF codes for airplanes, identification for friend and foe, and so forth. This could be a very sticky situation with their own military in Iraq and Saudi Arabia. So I suppose the Israelis probably have answers to this, but in terms of actual capabilities, the Israelis, I am sure, have what they say. I wouldn't take what they say as an empty bluff.
I want to answer that, Victoria, but I want to give you a chance, and then I'm going to wrap up if you have a comment on that question.
Oh, I was just going to, I mean, obviously I agree with Dave. The only comment I would have is that it would be so much better if we were engaged and coordinating with Israel's new friends in the region. I mean, if this action is necessary, it is something, if we don't participate and provide that leadership, it will potentially be much more difficult. But I agree with Dave. I think Israel has had to have this capability in place out of necessity.
The Obama administration went out of its way to make it hard for Israel to attack Iran in a number of ways. And I think that this is going to happen under the Biden administration too, that our intelligence assets are going to be looking at Israel. And we will do things to make it harder, just as Dave said, for Israel to launch an attack on Iran. I worry that the world has waited too long for a military attack on Iran to succeed in destroying or significantly setting back Iran's nuclear program. I'm worried too much of it has gone underground. Now, Israel knows a lot about where Iran was conducting nuclear activities, but you can assume most of them have moved. So I'm a little skeptical about how far this could go. I'm also worried about Iran acquiring advanced anti-aircraft missiles from Russia that would knock out Israeli jets. Now, there's other ways Israel could attack Iran, including cyber and with missiles. I don't think it's an easy question. My Israeli friends tell me Israel could do it, and I trust them, but I'm worried about this. With that, I'm gonna wrap up my part of this. I want to thank my very knowledgeable guests, Dr. Victoria Coates and Dr. David Wurmser, for an extremely informative discussion of this topic that I hope we can conduct again at a future time. Let's hope the situation with the Biden administration's Iran policy will improve. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today, and I'm going to turn it to my colleague, Matt Franklin, to wrap up.
Next week, our upcoming webinar on Wednesday, April 7th at 1 p.m. is entitled The Past, Present, and Future of Terror Finance Investigation, moderated by the Center's Kyle Scheidler and featuring Center Senior Fellow Raymond Orzel. We enjoyed having you all here today. Remember that the Center's important work is only possible because of your generous support. If you enjoy these weekly programs, please visit our website, securefreedom.org, and click on the big red donate button in the upper right corner where you can make an instant contribution by credit card and get information about other methods of giving. Thank you to our guests, and we'll see everyone else here next Wednesday at 1 p.m. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.